Hey, good evening, everyone. It's time to get started with our class. And tonight we will be studying from the book of Acts, chapter 21. Get your Bibles or your electronic devices ready, chapter 21 of Acts. And I got a royal chewing out from Daniel when he got back that I hadn't done enough quizzes. So we do have a quiz for now. He's laughing at me. We do have a quiz tonight to start things off. So, yeah, I know. Hey, this is all open response. It's not bad. It's Rick questions. You know what that's going to be like. So, okay, so we're going to focus on the journeys of Paul, which is chapters 13 through 20, since we're just wrapping all that up. And so, as Daniel has mentioned before, we've basically got two parts of Acts up through chapter 12, focus on Peter, chapters 13 to 28, focus on Paul. And there's kind of a subdivision in there in the latter part with Paul. So it's got his journeys through chapter 20 and the first part of 21, which we'll cover tonight, and then his imprisonment through the rest of the book. So we're going to take some time just to go over the journeys of Paul. So here's his first journey back from chapters 13 and 14. Okay. Which Roman official believed in Paphos while he was on Cyprus? So your choices are Julius Caesar, Nero, or Sergius Paulus. D. Do we have a D? What's that? Okay, yeah. It's Sergius Paulus. So he believed in Paphos on Cyprus. Thank you for the clarification. Yeah, okay. He's here, right. Okay, the Jews in Antioch stirred up the people against Paul because they were filled with, what was that? Envy, correct. Filled with envy against Paul and everyone that was believing the gospel. Number 3, Paul appointed what in every church? Oh, we knew that one. Okay. I'm glad you knew that one, Brian, because if you hadn't known that one, I would have been really, really worried. Okay. Next one, Acts chapter 15, where they had the conference in Jerusalem. This one should be very familiar. The key issue was whether the Gentile converts needed to be circumcised. Oh, man, good job, man. I think we knew that one. Was it? Okay, and the answer to that question was no, absolutely not. Okay, the Gentiles were told to stay away from what 4 things? Mac and cheese, sexual immorality, green olives, things strangled, the city of Corinth, blood, Roman taxes, or things offered to idols. Pick 4. Immorality, sexual immorality, things strangled, from blood, and offered. That's it. Exactly right. Okay, it's good. We got all 4. Next, over to the second journey, 16 through 18. Who joined Paul and Silas on this journey? George and Ringo, Barnabas and John Mark, Timothy and Luke. Timothy and Luke. Here it goes. Absolutely. I was thinking about this, and I know I'm aging out because how many people don't get George and Ringo? I mean that's really bad. Anyway, I'm going to quit that. Next, the Jews in Berea were more and searched the scriptures daily. Noble-minded or fair-minded, either one, depending on your translation. And last, even though Corinth was a morally corrupt city, Paul spent how many months preaching there, converting many? Close. 18 months, exactly. Okay. We're doing great. Okay, last one, third journey, 19 through where we are today. Paul revisited the churches he established to do what with the disciples? Encourage, strengthen. We're going to go with strengthen. Whoa! Man, that really blew that. Oh, man, I just gave everything away. Paul declared the whole counsel of God to the Ephesians, and the elders are to, Brian, sorry, Mike, elders are to shepherd the flock, right? Okay. That's the review. I told you it wouldn't be bad. I give you all the answers for the last one. Okay, wrapping up from our last study from Daniel on Sunday, Acts chapter 20, Paul heads towards Jerusalem to conclude his third journey, meets with the Ephesian elders for a final time in Miletus, which is not Ephesus proper, but it was on the coast and it allowed him to get to Jerusalem that much faster. You want to do this, Daniel? Is Acts 20? It's not Acts 10 plus 10. It's Acts 20, right? Acts 20, Ephesians, sorrow aplenty. Okay, So that's the memory one for this one. Okay, that's it for the review. Timeline, just to make sure we're grounded in this one again. Remember, the church started plus or minus AD 34, and now we're wrapping up the third missionary journey in AD 58, and that's overlapping with his imprisonment in Jerusalem that we're going to read about tonight. So we're talking about 24 years after Pentecost. Lots can happen in 2.5 decades, but that's basically the time frame that we're looking at. This is a busy map, but this just shows the path that he took all the way from Antioch up around Asia, over into Macedonia, Achaia, and then back around through Miletus, is where we left off in 20. So you can see Ephesus there, not that far from Miletus, and so the Ephesian elders had traveled that far to see him before he made his journey back. Then for his journey back, of course, he's going to end up today, as we go through the study, down in Tyre, Ptolemais, Caesarea, and finally Jerusalem to complete the journey. So quick Mac quiz here, the third journey, a round trip, about 2,800 miles. It's a long trip. So just imagine hopping on your horse or if you're walking, it's here to San Diego and back. So that's how far that trip is. That's a long trip. Especially if you're walking. Now, he had a fair amount of sea time in the last third of the trip, but still, I would be dog tired after all that. Okay, any questions about all that, where we've been before? If not, we will pick up in Acts chapter 21 tonight, and we'll read through the text, go through a quick summary. We've got some discussion topics to go over tonight, and then we'll go through our quad box to look at behaviors that we can learn from and apply to us as Christians today and as churches today. So, chapter 21, starting in verse 1. Now it came to pass that when we had departed from them and set sail, running a straight course, we came to Cos, the following day to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. And finding a ship sailing over to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. When we had sighted Cyprus, we passed it on the left, sailed to Syria, and landed at Tyre. For there was a ship, the ship was to unload her cargo. And finding disciples, we stayed there 7 days. They told Paul through the Spirit not to go up to Jerusalem. When we had come to the end of those days, we departed and went on our way, and they all accompanied us with wives and children till we were out of the city. And we knelt down on the shore and prayed. And when we had taken our leave of one another, we boarded the ship, and they returned home. And when we had finished our voyage from Tyre, we came to Ptolemais, greeted the brethren, and stayed with them 1 day. And the next day, or on the next day, we, who were Paul's companions, departed and came to Caesarea and entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. Now this man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied, and as we stayed many days, a certain prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. When he had come down to us, he took Paul's belt, bound his own hands and feet, and said, "Thus says the Holy Spirit, so shall the Jews at Jerusalem bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." Now when we heard these things, both we and those from that place pleaded with him not to go up to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "What do you mean by weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." So when he would not be persuaded, we ceased, saying, "The will of the Lord be done." And after those days we packed and went up to Jerusalem. Also some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, and brought with them a certain Mason of Cyprus, an early disciple, with whom we were to lodge. And when we had come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly. And on the following day Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. When we had greeted them, he told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said to him, "You see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, so that they may shave their heads and that all may know that those things of which they are informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Then Paul took them in, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him, that is Paul, in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. And all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. Now as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. And some among the multitude cried one thing and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after him, crying out, "Away with him." Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in Hebrew language, saying, and that's the worst chapter break ever. Jordan, I think you had this in the last time we read that, right? Yes, absolutely. So stay tuned. We'll get to this next week with our next Sunday with Daniel. Okay, a lot of reading, a lot happens there. And there's a lot that we're going to be able to focus in on tonight, both from an observation of behaviors of the church and how they interacted and some things that we can apply to ourselves. So, brief recap, first 15 verses. This is all pretty much geography and traveling. So Paul departs from Miletus and sails to Tyre, where he meets with the disciples for a full 7 days. They tell Paul through the Spirit not to go up to Jerusalem. So there's the warning that something bad's going to happen there. They sail on to Ptolemais and greet the brethren there for 1 day. And the next day they travel to Caesarea and stay with Philip the evangelist. Now he's noted as the one of the 7, which we read about all the way back in Acts chapter, remember, where we had the Grecian widows? 6. Oh, thank you, Jim. Yeah, Acts chapter 6, where we have the first church problem, Grecian widows not being taken care of every day. So Philip was one of the ones that was appointed to help with that. And after that, we read of his journeys. Now, we left him in Caesarea at the end of that chapter, and here we pick up with him again. So don't know if he's been there the whole time, but we left him there, and now we see him there again. Now, the interesting thing they say about Philip is that he had 4 daughters that did what? Prophesied, which is interesting. So he's got daughters that have the gift of the Holy Spirit, and they can prophesy. Now, quick question. If we were to jump over to 1 Corinthians, and probably chapter 14, where could these daughters not prophesy? What's that? Oh, if we jump over to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and we read about proper use of spiritual gifts, where could these 4 daughters not prophesy? In the assembly, absolutely. So they were not allowed to speak in the assembly with this, but there was obviously a place where they could. Otherwise, they couldn't prophesy at all. And remember that in 1 Corinthians are also told when they are doing that, they had to wear something. What was that? What was that? They had to cover their heads, exactly. So here we see a case where we have 4 women, daughters of Philip, that were able to prophesy, and we know from 1 Corinthians how they had to behave themselves, that this wasn't done in church, and when they did prophesy outside of church, they had to cover their heads. some side highlights there. So Agabus arrives, and we've seen Agabus before. Remember when Agabus showed up earlier in Acts? He prophesied something else then, too. Do you remember what it was? Famine, exactly. It was the famine that was going to take place, and they had contributions that they took up and helped take care of the brethren down in Judea. So he arrives. He's got a different prophecy this time. Prophesies that Paul will be bound by the Jews in Jerusalem. And again, the brethren tried to talk Paul out of going, but he refuses, and he says, I've got some parts of this cut out, but basically, I am ready to die for the name of the Lord Jesus. That's how committed he is, and he's going to go on to Jerusalem no matter what happens. Okay, that's the first 15 verses. So quick discussion point here. What can we learn from Paul and his companions about seeking out the saints during our travels? And I'll set this up in summary form. So during the last part of chapter 20, this first part of chapter 21, Paul stops at each of these cities: Troas, Miletus, Tyre, Ptolemais, Caesarea, and Jerusalem. What did he do in each city? What's that? Well, he met with them. Yeah, definitely he met with them. He sought out the saints in every city that he went to while he was traveling, which I think is a remarkable thing. Now, granted, he's on an evangelistic tour, so he's meant to be spreading the gospel, but also remember what it said that we just talked about. When he went on that third tour, he went back to strengthen the brethren. So he's all about taking time to strengthen the brethren as well as to preach the gospel. So the question for us is, how do we apply this to our travels? We've got means of traveling all over the world, people going all over to different places. Is there room for us to apply this principle or this concept to us today? I'm seeing some heads nodding up and down. Go to church. You find where the saints are, and you meet with them. And we're going to talk about some other things that they did during this particular set of verses here when we get to the quad. But you see a very rich interaction between those that were traveling as Christians and those that were being greeted and receiving them. It's a very rich interaction. So I think this is one of the things that we can also mimic in our lives, is that if we're traveling, wherever possible, we find the saints and we look to greet them and to seek them out. And in return, we are hoping for those saints to greet us and receive us in as brethren, which is just a great concept. So very consistent that this happens. And we read about this in other passages in the New Testament. Remember when Paul writes about Phoebe, who was traveling from Cenchrea over to Corinth, what did he tell the church in Corinth? To receive her and make sure that she was taken care of on whatever business she was in. So here's a traveling Christian that's going to find the saints, and he tells the saints, be sure you take her in, because that's the right thing to do. So we have lots of opportunity to take people in here in Bel Air, which is great, especially with the MDA patients and other medical patients we have. We have a great opportunity to do that. The encouragement is for us when we're traveling to make sure we look up saints in other areas and make sure we meet with them as we have that opportunity as well. Where were you last time, Robert? Well, it wasn't Singapore. I think it was London. You tracked down brethren in London, right? Or in England. It was what? Got it. Okay. They are. They pop up everywhere. So even though we're going to faraway places, we can find brethren to worship with. I think is a great thing. Ask Jordan. Well, he's going to say Ethiopia, but he may have some other stories. Do you have others? All over, yes. Anyway, it's a good thing for us to seek out the brethren and to meet with them when we have the opportunity. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. We'll keep going. Next set of verses, so 15 through 26. Here he gets to Jerusalem and stays with this guy named Mason, an early disciple, which I thought was an interesting description. What comes to your mind when you hear an early disciple? The 12? Oh, well, he was around to hear the 12, I'm sure, right? He could have been there on Pentecost or shortly thereafter. So this guy's been a Christian for plus or minus 24 years, an early disciple, which I thought was kind of an interesting description. So the brethren receive him gladly. Now, Daniel has mentioned this before, but as we read through Romans and 1 Corinthians, what else was Paul doing on this third missionary journey to take back to Jerusalem? What was that? Yes, he was gathering up funds, contributions, benevolence to bring back to the saints there. And also he had the companions from these churches that were sending money that were traveling with him. And so Paul and his traveling fellows, deliver the contribution from the Gentile churches, as was described in those two other passages. And Paul takes time to tell what God had done among the Gentiles, and that caused great rejoicing with the brethren there. So James and the elders, after that, tell him something I think is kind of interesting. Paul, you got a reputation here in Jerusalem. And guess what? The Jews aren't happy about it. What's the reputation? That you're commanding Jews in other places where the Gentiles are to forsake Moses, not to circumcise their children, and don't walk according to the customs. And this is a bad thing because people are going to assemble here, especially after they've heard that you're here, and we're anticipating there could be some issues. This could cause division, this could cause an uproar. We want to try and avoid that if at all possible. So what was the remedy? They asked Paul to do the following. Be purified for these 4 men that have taken a vow, probably the Nazirite vow, and paid their expenses, meaning for the sacrifices, that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law. Now, file that phrase away for a minute, because we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So, James and the elders confirmed that the Gentiles aren't subject to these Mosaic customs, or the customs from the law, that they confirm what they wrote back in chapter 15. They should keep themselves from the things offered to idols, blood, things strangled, and sexual immorality. So Paul goes ahead and he agrees, and he is purified with the men. He enters the temple, and he announces the expiration of the days of purification. These guys have gone through the gamut, and they're about ready to have offerings made up for each one of them. Now, you're getting the picture here, right? We're deep in Jewish territory here. Paul's been out amongst the Gentiles, and he's coming back to find out that this reputation could cause a problem in the church if it's not rectified. And Paul, based on the guidance of James and the elders, is set to fix this up. So, questions as we get into this. This will be our second discussion point. Did Paul sin by doing what he did? Brian.
I'll begin with the question because this is one where I don't know that I can even speculate on an answer. The disciples and the brethren in Jerusalem understand Paul's reputation for preaching the gospel, converting Jews, telling people not to follow the law of Moses, but of course the new covenant. And what they're saying is, this is a problem, and we want you to do certain things so they will not think you've been doing this, which I think they're wrong. And then I find that Paul complied with that. What's Paul supposed to do? Not teach Jews to be converted? To not do the things that his reputation precedes him on? I don't know the answer to that question, but it doesn't seem logical.
The circumcision party is the one that had the controversy, not the converters ones, I think.
Say that last part again.
The converters, they don't have that problem. The problem they have is their circumcision party.
Yeah.
That's the ones that are not, I guess, still, converted.
And I also would say this doesn't seem to be that they're trying to avoid problems in the church, because the church should understand, and certainly the inspired men ought to understand, that this is in fact what Paul was doing. In fact, they tell him this is what you're doing. I just lost my train of thought. So, okay, but the problem they were concerned about was with the Jews and not the church, I would hope.
I think these are Jewish Christians.
Well, then they got a huge problem, but Paul complied. I don't understand.
Yeah, we'll get into this. Daniel, I'm going to call on you in a minute. But next question. So at the end of the purification period, it says that offerings were going to be made. Did these offerings forgive sin? Nick.
So if we look back at what was required to fulfill a Nazirite vow, this was not a worship. So technically, he's not worshiping according to the Jews. What he's doing is he's following a custom. And is he violating his conscience in doing this? No. Is he showing the Jews that he still is kind of understands them? Yes. At least that's the way I read it.
Yeah, yeah. Hold that thought. What's the point? Okay, hold that thought just a second. Let's go on to one more. Patty, I'll get you in just a second. So last question that's kind of been alluded to, Cecilio. So how could Paul participate in this Jewish custom and preach that the Gentiles did not have to be circumcised or keep the Jewish customs? Was he contradicting himself, Brian?
I just have a follow-on.
Okay, hold that thought. Patty's on deck over here.
Oh, it's Albert. Albert's at home texting me.
Oh, he
that
is.
It's like the meat sacrificed to idols. He's relating it to that.
To that, okay. We're gonna, we're exactly gonna get there. Okay, Truth?
This isn't.
Did you guys hear that little? That was the can of worms opening up. Okay, and so they're crawling all over the place now. Go ahead, Truth.
This is definitely not a definitive answer, and this may be a different circumstance. In fact, I can't remember exactly what this is, but I do remember another instance in which Paul commanded, I think he commanded Timothy to be circumcised in another instance for the sake of others in the church. And in another instance, he commanded Titus, definitely don't do that, don't be circumcised. So, yeah, I wonder how much of it depends on circumstance. I'm not exactly sure if that's a similar circumstance, but it made me think of that. So,
Okay, we're going to offer some thoughts here and then continue the discussion here. So it was well, I'll get to that in a minute. So looking back at that, was it wrong for anyone to be circumcised, Jew or Gentile? Was it wrong? It's not sinful. What was wrong about circumcision, the way the Jews were looking at it towards the Gentiles? When it was they said it was a binding thing that you had to do that to be a Christian and serve God. That was wrong. But the act of circumcision itself was not wrong. So if you wanted to follow the Jewish prior custom, call it that, of circumcision, you were fine to do that. But don't think it was required to be a Christian and follow Christ from that point on.
It's like saying you first have to be Jewish.
That's a good point, yes. You're gonna be, because it was the pathway to Jesus, they would think, by being a Jew. So let me ask another question. If you had been raised as a Jew and you were taught the most substantial thing that you could do to say, I am going to be devoted to God and follow his commands, what would that act have been as a Jew? Nazirite vow, yes. So that was the ultimate statement to say, I'm going to be a follower of God. Now, if I'm a Jewish Christian and I've been brought up that way and I'm going to devote my life, and I'm not saying this is what they said, I'm just putting this out here for discussion. If I'm a Jewish Christian, I've been brought up with the Nazirite vow concept, and I'm going to say I'm going to devote my life to Christ, what might I think is a good thing to do? Maybe take the Nazirite vow as a custom. Again, not as something that's required to be a Christian, but as a custom to say, I am showing that I'm going to devote my life, and here's the way I'm doing it. Maybe, don't know if that's what their thought process was, but that's how they had been brought up, and this could be a step that they could have thought would make the point that they're going to devote their lives to God. There's a lot of things that we could talk about all of this. The bottom line is the difference between binding law to be bound on a person to be a Christian, coming from the Mosaic customs, and the idea of a custom, something that we've done in our past that's allowed. Paul's going to talk about this in 1 Corinthians when he talks about meat sacrificed to idols, but he also talks about days, seasons, and things like that some of the Jews would keep, but the Gentiles wouldn't. And he said, it's no matter. You're free to do both. It's okay. Do not bind it on the other. Okay, same thing for meat sacrificed to idols. If you've got the clarity of concept or clarity of mind to say this is not a sin, you're okay to eat it. But if it offends your mind or your conscience, don't do it. And in fact, brother, you don't eat it either, so you don't tempt your brother to eat it. So we're to stay away from those things. So we're in this realm now where we do have the Jewish law that's been there. We do have the customs that have been there, and some of the Jews evidently want to keep those customs going forward. They cannot bind them on the Gentiles. James and the elders made that clear. They made that absolutely clear. That's not what this is all about. But the Jews that were brought up that way feel that it's the right thing to do for them as they're following Christ. That's what it seems to be. Now, I've got a lot of crazy looks out in the audience. So, thoughts, comments about that? Okay, Daniel.
All that was very well said. And so just to kind of maybe address Brian's question from earlier, you could think about it like three doors, like two extreme and incorrect, positions, and then the one that's kind of in the middle. Number one is, as we said, that Gentiles must keep the customs of the law of Moses, bind it on them in order to be saved. Paul's already established that's not correct, right? And door number three, what the Jews accused Paul of was saying, you're not allowed to keep the customs of the law of Moses. To keep the customs of the law of Moses is wrong and sinful. That's what they were accusing Paul of saying. And that's not correct either. Like you said, you're free to keep those things in Christ as an individual, or, according to, you said, to the freedom of your conscience. And so Paul engages in the custom at the temple in order to show that he is a proponent of door number two, which is these things are not bound on anyone in order to be a Christian, but there is freedom to do it. And Paul says, even I feel free to offer this vow, to go through this custom at the temple. I am not opposed to the keeping of these Mosaic customs. So that's, I think, how Paul is handling the situation here.
As custom, not as law to be a Christian, right?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, Jordan, 1 second. Paul's going to say a little bit later in Acts that he has lived in all good conscience. That would include this act that he's doing right now. So I don't see how he can make that statement and think he was doing something wrong in this particular instance. But, back to what Daniel said, it's custom. We're at liberty to keep those as long as we're not binding those to say it's required to be a Christian. Go ahead, Jordan.
So both y'all well said, and I think that makes sense to me. I think the rebuttal, though, to door number two, to your point, Daniel, is that James and the elders told Paul he needed to do this. This was not Paul saying, hey, here's what I'm going to do. It was, it seems to me, somewhat directive, saying, hey, you need to do this in order to, to do this. So for me, maybe to Brian's point, I think about this more just from Paul is at Jerusalem. He wants to associate with the brethren there. The elders say, in essence, we would like for you to do this, and Paul doesn't throw up the flag saying, no, I'm free to do whatever. You know what I mean? I have that authority, I have that right. He later writes to the Corinthians about that specifically, I guess. But in order to adhere or have fellowship or have harmony, not create problems, Paul chose to do this. So to me, that's where it's a little bit different about the door number two, per se, is that there was a directive from him, but Paul, again, I'm assuming, made the conscious decision, this is something I can do, I'm comfortable doing, in order to fall under the guidance of the apostles of Jerusalem.
Right, and one thing that does come to mind is that it was James and the elders. Now, who knows the flock best? It could be the elders. And so when they proposed this, they know the people involved, they know the flock, and they know a good way to approach this would be this. And I think that's why they end up doing that, as part of their shepherding the flock. Go ahead, Nick.
Not doing this to offend, even though I have a liberty to do something.
Right.
Someone else has a liberty to do something, and I shouldn't forbid them because it would offend them. It's, to me, Romans 14 would apply, even though Romans 14 at this point in time, I don't think had been written yet. Right?
Actually, I think it has, yes,
has?
because he's already talked about the collecting
Yeah.
the benevolence to take back.
Yeah, so Romans 14, it would, would apply here.
Right. Right. Who else? Angel, and then Ryan, then we're going to have to move on. Go ahead, Angel.
Thanks, Nick, for bringing that up, because I was also going to point out, just going off that first question when you put it up, Romans 7 speaks about how we're released from the law. It talks about, he gives the analogy of the adulterous woman is bound to her husband, but if her husband dies, she's free to remarry. And then it's the same way with Christ. We put put on Christ. So we're free from the old law and we're now bound to Christ. And then it says, but was this law that you practice sin? And he said, by no means. And he, it's a different perspective from 1 Corinthians, but in a sense of like, you were not, we were, I think he said that he's covetousness. And then he goes on and explaining that, but that just came to realize that we need Christ in our life to be saved and stuff like that. But that's another point that came to my mind.
Good one, Angel. And Brian.
This is all good. I think it's going to be one thing that perhaps we don't ever reach a definitive conclusion. It does appear to me that the brethren in Jerusalem have a misguided motive. I mean, what I'm looking here is do this so that they will know there's nothing to the things which they've been told about you. Well, the things that have been told about him are he's preaching the gospel and telling them not to be circumcised and so forth. But what we don't know is why Paul submitted. And I do know, I forget my passage, maybe Daniel, you can recite it, but Paul says, I become all things to all men for the sake of preaching the gospel. And that sounds like what he's trying to do here, so he doesn't want to create a ruckus among them. But even then, that doesn't fully reconcile, because I would think, like as he wrote to the Galatians, why are you doing these things that are consistent with the law? When the motive conveyed to him by the elders in Jerusalem was to prove that you weren't teaching these things, and in fact he is and was and does and is. So I'll just have to struggle with that.
Well, it's a difficult passage, and it's an interesting thing that happens here, and that leads to my next question. So what do we take from this that applies to us today? So we see Paul and the Jerusalem church, James and the elders, they took this action, and it's a balance of doctrine as a Christian, conscience, what's allowable with your conscience, and expedience also in the name of church unity. They took some extraordinary steps here to make sure that the church didn't divide itself over this rumor about what Paul was preaching. And I think the rumor was that he was telling the Jews not to do these things, and that's what they were upset about. Not so much the Gentiles, but you were telling Jews not to do this? Wait a minute. So they're getting that fixed up to make sure that the church doesn't split over this thing and over Paul's preaching. So one of the things, I'm trying to find it here real quick, and that you keep the law, that you yourself also walk orderly, true, and keep the law. Did Paul keep the law? Trick question. You know why I'm smiling, right? It's a trick question. Okay, did he kind of keep the law? How did he keep the law?
He performed a vow in the temple that was
According to a custom, right? I mean, according to the law, but yeah, it was one of the okay, and the reason I'm smiling is, what was the last thing that Moses said, the exit clause to the law was? There'll come a prophet like me, hear ye him. And so in the purest form, we are obeying the law and obeying that commandment from Moses when we say, Jesus, our prophet, our Savior, we're following him. So you can say that, yes, we're technically following that last commandment of the law because we're following Jesus. I mean, for a Jew, that would be very true, that would be the last thing that they would do. But they were accusing him of saying, or are telling him to say, you yourself walk orderly and keep the law. So he could say, yeah, I'm keeping the law. I'm doing what Moses told us to do now that Jesus is here. But anyway, difficult passage here. Interesting, they're taking these steps to preserve unity in the church. Do we have opportunities today to do the same thing? Okay, Ryan's on point.
The one example I could possibly think of is that if you're traveling and you go to a church and it's scripturally sound in every way, and, well, let's just say you've been invited to preach there, but they're a one-cup church. They don't use the individual churches, individual cups, but one cup and they pass it. Would you create a ruckus to disrupt that entire thing? Because clearly in my mind that it's not a sin to partake of one cup. It's just not required to do it. And that's the closest I can come to it.
That's a good one. I think that's a really good one. And there's a church in London, meets across from the British Library. They have a 1 cup service, not because they insist that it can only be 1 cup, but that's just the way they choose to do it. And then you will see Kimbra try to levitate the fruit of the vine and not touch the lip of the cup to make sure that she can partake, but not. Yeah, you too, right? Okay, same thing. Sorry, Kimbra. I'm going to pay for that later. But they do. That's right. And then you get to sit in the back and you get served first. Yes. Anyway. You never know. Anyway, did you have a? I thought I saw a hand.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but I just, Jordan said something earlier about, like, Paul had the right to refuse to do this suggestion here, but for the sake of others, for the sake of unity, to your point, he acquiesced to do something that, to our point, was not wrong, and he did that as a show of love, as a show of unity, as a humble act. And I just feel like whatever the circumstance is, there's so much for us to learn in that, because especially as modern Americans, we are so hung up on our rights. And it's like, well, I don't have to do what you're telling me to do, and I have the right to do it this other way. And whenever those opportunities come up for us to swallow our pride, lay aside our rights, and say, I'll go along with the way that things are done here, as long as that's, as we've said, not offending my conscience and not a sin. I'll go along with that. The customs, the cultures, the practices that may seem odd and strange, because I care more about my brother, care more about unity of the church than about I'm going to do what I want to do and nobody can tell me otherwise.
Right. Good point, Daniel. Thank you so much. And when we talk about expedience, there's a prerequisite for something to be an expedient. What is that? What's that? It has to be lawful and not sinful. We have the option to do it or not. That's what expedience is. But if anything is not lawful, we're not allowed to do that and can't claim that it's an expedient. So in this case, this is how they solve the matter. We see that from time to time, places here. Here's a weird one for you. If you're traveling to Southeast Asia from time to time, we talk about meat sacrificed to idols. You may go to a Chinese restaurant where they have offered their food to Buddha. And you may see a little statue of Buddha, and has the 2 little incense poles, and there's a little portion of food there in the front. They have literally offered the food to Buddha first, and you may be eating it. Now, who knew? You know, and is that going to bother you as a Christian or not? It may or may not, but that's an exact analogy to what we're told about in 1 Corinthians and in Romans about meat sacrificed to idols. That was food that's been sacrificed to an idol. What do we do with that? So it does happen. You know, maybe not here locally. We don't see that much, but if you travel around, that kind of thing can happen. Okay, I think we beat that one to death, but thanks for all the comments. Let's, I want to hit one other thing here. So we know what happened in the last part of this. The Jews grab him. They're going to try and kill him. Roman commander, that means he's got 1,000 men, rush to the uproar, and they bind Paul just like Agabus said, hand and foot, which is interesting. Can't get a straight answer, so they take him back to the garrison. Paul straightens out he's not that Egyptian that was leading all these 4,000 men as assassins, and he asked to speak. So now, stay tuned, because Daniel gets to cover this in the next one. So, real quick, is civil government's doing its God-given job correctly? What should be the relationship between Christians and government? We don't have time to discuss this, but kind of listed this. We've got to be subject to the government, don't resist, submit to every ordinance, pay our taxes, honor the king, and obey God rather than men if it comes to that. And then the government, I like this one. I want to put this on a placard and send it to Washington. They exist by the authority of God. They are to be a terror to evil works, but they're to give praise to those that do good. And they're supposed to be God's minister to Christians for good. Now, as we get through the rest of his Roman imprisonment, let's keep this in mind, because we're going to look to see if the Roman government's doing their job or not through this. So thanks for all the comments tonight. I did have a bunch of stuff in the quad box that we did not get to. Sorry. Hurry. There we go. You can read these online. And I'm trying to get to, there we go. Nope. So Paul concludes his 3rd journey in Jerusalem, keeps peace in the church, is seized by the Jewish mob, and then held by the Romans. The memory thing is Acts 20+1. Paul's freedom undone. Okay, so that's how we're going to remember that. So next class, Acts 22. And Daniel will be covering that this coming Sunday. Thank you very much for the comments tonight. Really appreciate it.